What if the people we remember as raiders, as shadows appearing out of the northern mist to fall upon a quiet monastery, were in truth farmers and traders and poets who read the stars, followed the coastlines of half the known world, and carried their language and their gods across an ocean that most others feared to cross? What if the age we call the Viking Age was not a single storm of violence, but a long, restless chapter in the life of a northern people who were reshaping the map of the world, even as they were being reshaped by it? Tonight, we will follow the long and quiet story of the Norsemen, from the cold shores and deep fjords of Scandinavia, through the years of the first raids and the great voyages, across the seas to Britain and Ireland, down the rivers of the east toward the great cities of the south, and out into the empty gray Atlantic toward Iceland, Greenland, and a shoreline in the far west that Europe would soon forget. We will walk through their farms and their halls, listen to the sound of their ships, and watch as a scattered people of the north became, for a few centuries, one of the great moving forces of the medieval world before they settled, converted, and slowly folded back into the ordinary life of Europe. So let the room grow still around you, lower the lights, rest your head, and let this calm journey through the northern world move slowly and gently, like a ship drifting home on a quiet tide. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, nothing you must remember. You may simply listen and let the old world settle softly around you as you drift toward sleep. And if you find comfort in these slow walks through history, in these quiet hours spent among old ships and older stones, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever the night feels long and you would like another calm journey through the past. There is no hurry in this place. We will always begin gently, and we will always end in peace. Now let us go back, far back, to the north of Europe more than 1,200 years ago, to a world of long winters and short bright summers, of dark forests and pale seas, where the story of the Norsemen begins not with a sword, but with the land itself. Scandinavia is a hard and beautiful place, and to understand the people who came from it, we must first understand the shape of the world that made them. Picture the far north of Europe as a great arm of land and water reaching up toward the pole. To the west, along what is now Norway, the coast is broken into countless fjords, deep fingers of the sea that push far inland between steep gray mountains, so that the land and the water are folded together into a maze of stone and salt. To the east, across the mountains, lies a gentler country of forests and lakes, the land that would become Sweden. And to the south, low and green and reaching toward the rest of Europe, lies the peninsula and islands of Denmark, flat farming country surrounded by shallow seas and narrow straits. This was not an empty land. People had lived here for thousands of years, hunting, fishing, and slowly learning to farm the thin soils and the short growing seasons. By the 8th century after Christ, the time when our story truly begins, the north was a patchwork of small communities, each rooted in its own valley or island or stretch of coast. There were no great cities here as there were in the south. No marble forums or stone cathedrals, no emperors ruling from distant capitals. Instead, there were farms scattered across the good land wherever the good land could be found, and around those farms a way of life shaped entirely by the rhythm of the seasons and the nearness of the sea. Life in the north was demanding, and it taught its people a certain patience and toughness that would mark them for centuries. The winters were long and dark, and in the far north the sun would barely rise for weeks at a time, so that the world sank into a blue and silver twilight, broken only by firelight, and on clear cold nights, by the shifting green curtains of the aurora far overhead. Families gathered in their long timber halls, close around the central hearth, while the wind moved over the roof and the snow gathered against the walls. This was the season of stories, of firelight and mending and waiting, when the tales of gods and heroes were passed from voice to voice in the warm dark, and children learned who they were by learning where they came from. And then, each year, a long dark would slowly break, the days would stretch, the ice would loosen, and the short, brilliant summer would come rushing in, when the sun barely set at all and the whole northern world seemed awake at once. This was the season of work and of movement. Fields had to be sown and tended and harvested in a hurry. for the growing time was brief. Animals were driven up to the high summer pastures. Boats were repaired, nets were mended, and the sea, which in winter was a gray and dangerous barrier, became once more a road. It is this rhythm, the deep patience of the winter and the sudden urgency of the summer, that shaped the northern character, and that would in time send its people out across the water. The people of the north lived, above all, from the land and the sea together. On their farms they raised cattle and sheep and pigs and goats, and they grew barley and oats and rye where the soil allowed. Barley was especially important, for from it they brewed the ale that filled the drinking horns in the long halls. And a good harvest meant not only food for the winter, but the means of hospitality and celebration. Along the coasts and rivers they fished for cod and herring and salmon, drying and salting the catch to carry them through the lean months. In the forests they hunted and trapped animals for their furs, and the great northern forests gave them timber, the most precious material of all, for from timber they built their halls, their homes, and the ships that would carry their name across the world. We should pause here, at the very beginning, on the matter of ships, because more than any king or any battle, it was the ship that made the Viking Age possible. The peoples of the north had been building boats for a very long time, but in the centuries before the raids began, their shipbuilders reached a kind of quiet perfection. They learned to build vessels from overlapping planks of oak, fastened with iron rivets, each plank shaped by hand and fitted so cleverly that the whole hull could flex and bend with the sea rather than fighting against it. The result was a ship that was light, strong, and astonishingly seaworthy, a vessel that could ride over the great swells of the open ocean and yet draw so little water that it could be rowed up a shallow river or run straight onto a beach. Two great gifts came together in these ships. There was the sail, a broad square of woven wool, dyed and strengthened, that could catch the wind and carry a ship for days across the open sea. And there were the oars, ranked along both sides, so that when the wind failed or the water grew narrow, the crew could pull the ship forward by the strength of their own arms. A ship that could both sail the ocean and row the rivers was a key that could open almost any door in the medieval world, and the Norsemen would use that key again and again, in ways that no one, least of all themselves, could have fully foreseen. To build such a ship was the work of many hands over many months, and it was expensive, requiring good timber, skilled labor, iron for the rivets, and wool for the sail. A great ship was therefore a sign of wealth and power, and the chieftains and kings who could command such vessels could command the loyalty of the men who rowed them. We can still see something of this world today, because a few of these ships have survived, preserved in the earth as the graves of the powerful, in the soft blue clay of a Norwegian burial mound. Archaeologists uncovered a ship now known as the Oseberg ship, buried early in the 9th century as the grave of two women of high rank, its prow curling upward into a carved spiral of interlaced beasts. In that grave and others like it lay not only the ship, but the things the dead were thought to need, so that even now, more than 1,000 years later, we can look upon the actual timber, the actual carvings, the actual sledges and buckets and beds of the northern world, and feel how near the past can sometimes come. Now we must speak of how these people governed themselves, for it helps us understand what came later. The North was not, in these early centuries, a land of great unified kingdoms. Instead, power was local and personal. A region might be led by a chieftain, a man whose authority rested on his wealth, his family, his generosity, and above all his ability to protect and reward his followers. Loyalty flowed between a lord and his men in both directions. The lord gave gifts, feasts, land, and treasure, and in return his men gave him their service, their labor, and if it came to it, their lives in battle. This was a world where reputation was a kind of currency, where a man was measured by his honor and his word, and where insults and injuries were remembered for generations. Yet, it was not a lawless world, and this is something worth remembering, because the popular image of the Norsemen as wild and chaotic is only a small and distorted part of the truth. The northern peoples had a strong sense of law and of justice, though their law was not written down in these early years but held in memory and spoken aloud. At certain times, free men would gather at an assembly, a meeting called the Thing, where disputes were settled, agreements were made, and grievances were aired before the community. A man skilled in remembering and reciting the law held a place of great respect. Justice was not always gentle, and feuds between families could run for years, but there was a deep expectation that quarrels would be brought into the open and settled by rule and custom rather than by endless private violence. Beneath the fierce reputation lay a people who cared a great deal about fairness, obligation, and the keeping of one's word. We should also step quietly and respectfully into the world of their beliefs, for the gods of the North were a living presence in every household. The people of Scandinavia worshipped a family of gods whose names still echo faintly in our own week. In Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, there was Odin, the wise and unsettling god of poetry, wisdom, and the dead, who was said to have given one of his eyes for a drink from the well of knowledge, and who wandered the world in disguise seeking secrets. There was Thor, the great red-bearded god of thunder, strong and dependable, the protector of ordinary folk and farmers, whose hammer was thought to bless and to guard, and whose small silver images were worn around the necks of men and women for protection. There was Freyja, goddess of love and fertility, and also of a certain kind of magic and of the slain, and many others besides, a whole society of gods who quarreled and feasted and struggled much as human beings did. These gods lived, in the imagination of the North, in a great tree that held all the worlds together, its roots and branches reaching through the realms of gods and giants and men and the dead, and over all of it hung a strange and heavy knowledge, the belief that even the gods themselves would one day face a final battle, a doom in which the old order would be broken and swallowed, and from which a new world would slowly rise. There is something in this vision that seems to match the land itself, the long darkness and the returning light, the sense of hardship endured and of renewal waiting on the far side of the cold. It was not a religion of gentle comfort, but it gave the people of the North a way of facing a hard world with courage, and it filled their winters with the deep pleasure of stories. Much of what we know of these beliefs comes to us from a later time, written down centuries afterward, mostly in Iceland, by people who were already Christian, but who wished to preserve the old tales of their ancestors. And so we must be careful, for the myths, as we have them, have passed through many hands and many years, and historians still debate how much of what was written down truly reflects what the people of the 8th and 9th centuries actually believed. What seems likely is that belief varied from place to place and from family to family, that the gods were honored with feasts and sacrifices at the turning points of the year, and that for most people religion was less a matter of doctrine than of custom, of doing the right things at the right times to keep the household safe and the harvest good. Let us now stand for a moment in one of their halls, on an ordinary winter evening, near the end of the 8th century, before the wider world had ever heard the word that would come to mean terror. The hall is a long building of timber and turf, its roof low and its single great room dim with smoke, for the fire burns in a long hearth down the center, and the smoke drifts up to escape through openings in the roof. Along the walls run raised platforms where the household sits and sleeps, and the light of the fire moves over faces and over the tools and weapons and woven hangings that decorate the space. Outside, the wind is moving, and the snow is deep, and the sea is gray and impassable. Inside, there is warmth and ale and the smell of roasting meat, and the sound of a voice telling a story that everyone has heard before and loves to hear again. The people in this hall are not so very different from us. They love their children and worry about the harvest. They tell jokes and hold grudges and mourn their dead. The women of the household command great respect and real authority, holding the keys to the storerooms and managing the affairs of the farm, especially when the men were away. And in the sagas that were later written down, we meet women of fierce intelligence and strong will. The men farm and fish and mend their tools, and in the good season take to the sea. Children learn the work of the farm and the words of the old stories. It is a small world, bounded by the mountains and the water, and for most of the people who live in it, it will remain small all their lives. And yet, from this quiet northern world, within a single lifetime, ships would set out that would reach the monasteries of Britain, the rivers of Russia, the markets of the great southern cities, and the empty shores of lands no European had ever named. Why did they go? This is one of the great questions of the whole story, and it has no single simple answer. Historians have argued over it for a very long time, and the truth is almost certainly a weaving together of many threads. Part of the answer lies in the land itself, in the shortage of good farmland and a growing population, so that younger sons who could not inherit a farm might look outward for a future. Part of it lies in the ships, in that technology of the seaworthy vessel that suddenly made the wider world reachable. Part of it lies in wealth and trade, in the discovery that the lands to the south and east held silver and treasure and goods that the north desired. Part of it lies in the political world, in ambitious chieftains and would-be kings who needed plunder and glory to reward their followers and build their power. And part of it, surely, lies simply in the restless human hunger to see what is beyond the horizon, a hunger that these people with their extraordinary ships were suddenly free to follow. Whatever the mixture of causes, the wider world first felt the change in the last years of the 8th century, and the moment that later ages fixed upon as the beginning came in the summer of the year 793, at a small island off the northeast coast of Britain called Lindisfarne. On that island stood a monastery, one of the holiest places in the Christian world of the north, a house of monks who copied and illuminated beautiful manuscripts, who prayed and studied and tended the sick, and who kept alive the light of learning in a rough age. The monastery was rich, for it held treasures given by pious kings and nobles, gold and silver and jeweled books, and it was defenseless, for who would attack a house of God at the edge of the sea? And then, one summer day, ships came out of the north, and men climbed from them onto the shore, and they fell upon the monastery. They took the treasures, they killed some of the monks and carried others away, and they departed again over the sea as suddenly as they had come. To the scholars of Christian Europe, it was as if something monstrous had risen from the deep. A learned man named Alcuin, an Englishman then living at the court of the great Frankish king Charlemagne far to the south, wrote letters of grief and horror, asking how such a thing could be allowed to happen to so holy a place. The sources that survive are almost all written by these frightened churchmen, and so the raiders come to us first as figures of terror, appearing without warning, striking at the very heart of the sacred, and vanishing back into the sea. We must hold this moment carefully because it matters both for what it was and for what it was not, for the monks of Lindisfarne, and for the many communities that would suffer in the years to come. The raids were a real and terrible thing, a season of fear that would last for generations. We should not soften that, nor pretend it away, but we should also understand that this violent first contact gave the wider world a lasting image of the Norsemen that captured only one small part of who they were. The same people who could descend upon a monastery could also, in the same years, be found trading peacefully in busy markets, farming quiet valleys, settling new lands, and building towns. The raider and the farmer, the plunderer and the poet, were very often the very same men, wearing different faces in different seasons of their lives. After Lindisfarne came other raids on other islands and coasts, on the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, and the north of Britain, and on the shores of the Frankish Empire across the sea. In the early years, these were mostly small and swift, a handful of ships arriving in summer, striking at a rich and undefended place, and sailing home again before any organized resistance could gather. The very speed and unpredictability of the ships was their great weapon, for no one could know where they would strike. And the long coastlines of Britain, Ireland, and the continent offered 1,000 vulnerable places. Bells were rung in warning, and prayers were added to the church services, asking God for deliverance from the fury of the northern men. And along the coasts, people learned to watch the sea with a new and anxious eye. Yet, even in these early decades, the story was already more than raiding. Alongside the raiders went traders, and indeed the line between the two was often blurred, for a shipload of northern men might trade where they were strong and raid where they were weak. choosing whichever course promised the greater profit at the least risk. The north had goods the wider world wanted: furs from the cold forests, walrus the fur from the Arctic seas, amber from the Baltic shores, iron, timber, and in a darker trade that we must not pass over, captured people sold into slavery. And the wider world had goods the north desired, above all silver, which the Norsemen prized greatly, along with fine cloth, wine, glass, and the luxuries of southern lands. That trade in captured people is one of the hard truths of this story, and honesty requires us to name it plainly, though we need not dwell on its cruelties. The taking and selling of human beings was woven into the economy of the age, not only among the Norsemen but across much of the medieval world, and the raids that seized treasure also seized people, who were carried off and sold in distant markets. The suffering behind that trade was real and immense, and it sits alongside the achievements and the artistry as part of the whole picture of the age. We remember it not to condemn a people across 1,000 years, but because the truth of history includes its shadows as well as its light, and because the ordinary human beings caught up in that trade deserve to be remembered too. As the 9th century went on, the character of the raids began to change. And this is a slow and important shift that we should follow carefully. The small summer raids gave way, in time, to something larger and more dangerous. The northern fleets grew, and instead of striking and sailing home, they began to stay. They started to spend the winter in the lands they had come to plunder, building fortified camps at the mouths of rivers or on defensible islands, and from these bases they could raid far inland throughout the year. And once they were staying, the next step followed almost naturally, for men who wintered in a rich and fertile land might begin to wonder why they should ever leave it at all. Raiding was slowly turning into conquest, and conquest into settlement. In the meantime, life in the northern homelands went on. While the fleet sailed and the chroniclers of the south wrote their frightened accounts, the great majority of the people of Scandinavia never went raiding at all. They stayed on their farms and their valleys, along their fjords and coasts, and they lived the old life of sowing and reaping, fishing and herding, feasting in winter and working in summer. The wealth that flowed back from the raids and the trade did change their world, for silver flowed into the north in great quantities, and with it came new goods and new tastes and new ambitions. Trading towns began to grow. Places like Hedeby in the south of the Danish lands and Birka on its island in a Swedish lake, where merchants gathered and craftsmen worked, and goods from half the world changed hands. These towns were small by the standards of the great cities of the south, but they were busy and cosmopolitan, full of the sounds of many trades and the accents of distant places. Let us walk for a little while through such a town, for it shows us a side of the Norse world very different from the fury of Lindisfarne. Imagine the trading settlement of Hedeby on a summer day, a cluster of timber houses along a shallow harbor, protected by a great earthen rampart. The streets are laid with wooden planks over the soft ground, and along them stand the workshops of the craftsmen. Here a smith works iron into tools and weapons, the ring of his hammer carrying over the noise of the town. There a woman weaves cloth on an upright loom, its clay weights hanging in rows. In another workshop, a craftsman carves combs from the antlers of deer, patient work that filled countless hours. And in another, a beadmaker melts and shapes bright glass into ornaments. Down at the harbor, ships are drawn up on the shore, and their crews are unloading and loading, and merchants are haggling over furs and cloth and silver by weight, using small folding scales and sets of neat little weights to measure the value of the metal. In such a town you might hear many tongues and meet many kinds of people. There were Norsemen, of course, but also traders from the Frankish lands, from the Slavic countries to the east, from far-off places whose goods had traveled hand to hand across enormous distances. Coins from distant lands turn up in the archaeology of these towns. Silver pieces struck in the great cities of the Islamic world, far to the southeast, carried north along the rivers of the east, through an astonishing chain of trade. The Norsemen themselves valued silver so much that they often cared little for the coins as coins, cutting them into pieces and weighing them for their metal, so that in their hoards we find not only whole coins but fragments, cut rings, and broken ornaments, all reckoned by weight. To hold one of those cut silver coins today is to hold a small witness to a web of connection that stretched from the markets of the Middle East to a wooden town on a cold northern shore. And so the northern world in these years was living a double life, and it is this doubleness that makes their stories so rich and so difficult to sum up in a single word. On the one hand, there was the violence of the raids, the fear along the coasts, the burning of monasteries, the seizing of treasure and of people. On the other hand, there was the patient life of the farms, the busy life of the trading towns, the artistry of the shipwrights and smiths and weavers, and the slow spreading of a people outward across the seas in search of land and wealth and a future. The same ships carried both stories. The same men might belong to both. To understand the Viking Age is to hold these things together, not to choose between them, but to see the whole shape of a people at a moment when their world was suddenly opening outward in every direction. As the 9th century deepened, that opening would carry the Norsemen far beyond the coasts they first raided, into the very heart of the lands to the west and the south and the east, where they would no longer be passing shadows but settlers, rulers, and eventually neighbors and kinsmen of the people they had once terrified. The story of the raids was only the beginning. What came next was the slower, deeper story of how a raiding people became a settling people, and how the map of Europe itself began quietly to change. For now, let the ships rest on their beaches, and the fire burn low in the long hall, and the snow lie deep and silent over the northern valleys. Let the old world settle around you, the sea gray and patient beyond the fjords, the stars cold and clear above the mountains, and the whole of the north waiting quietly for the summer and the sail. Rest here a while, in the warmth and the firelight, and we will go on together when you are ready. And so the story moves quietly forward, out of the homeland and across the water, following the wake of the northern ships into the lands where they would leave their deepest marks. To understand what came next, we must cross the sea to the islands of Britain and Ireland, where within a single generation the pattern of raiding gave way to something far larger, and where the men of the north came at last not merely to take, but to stay. By the middle of the 9th century, the fleets that fell upon Britain were no longer the small summer raids of the earlier years. In the year 865, a great force came ashore in the east of England, a fleet and army so much larger than anything seen before that the English chroniclers called it simply the Great Army. This was not a raid to be endured and forgotten. It was a force that had come to stay, to winter in the land, and in time, to rule it. And in the years that followed, this army moved across the divided kingdoms of England, which were then not one country but several separate realms, often rivals, each with its own king and its own borders. One by one, the old English kingdoms fell before the northern army or were forced into submission. The kingdom of Northumbria in the north, with its great center at York, was overrun, and York itself, an old Roman city, became a Norse-ruled town, a center of trade and power that would flourish for generations under a new name and a new lordship. The kingdom of East Anglia fell and its king was killed, remembered afterward by the English as a martyr. The kingdom of Mercia in the Midlands was broken and divided. Within a few short years, it seemed that all of England might pass under the rule of the northern men, and that the old order of the English kingdoms might simply come to an end. But it did not end, and the reason it did not lies in one kingdom, and in large part in one man. In the south of England lay the kingdom of Wessex, the land of the West Saxons, and in the darkest hour when the other kingdoms had fallen, it was Wessex that held. Its king, a young man named Alfred, came to the throne in 871 in the midst of the crisis, and for years he struggled against the northern army with mixed fortune, winning some battles and losing others, and at one desperate point being driven into hiding in the marshes of the southwest, his kingdom seemingly at the edge of collapse. Later tradition would gather many stories around this low moment, some of them surely more legend than history, but the core of the matter is clear enough. Alfred did not give up. From the marshes he gathered his strength, called his people back to him, and came out to face the northern army once more. In the year 878, Alfred met the army in battle and defeated it, and this victory changed the whole course of the story in England. It did not drive the Norsemen out, for they were far too deeply rooted for that. Instead, it led to a kind of settlement, an agreement that divided the land. The northern leader agreed to accept baptism into the Christian faith, with Alfred himself standing as his sponsor, and the two sides drew, in effect, a line across England. To the south and west lay the England of the English, ruled by Alfred and his heirs. To the north and east lay a great swath of country that came under northern law and northern settlement, a region later known by a name that captured its character, the Danelaw, the land where the law of the Danes held sway. And here we come to one of the quiet, deep truths of the Viking Age, which is that its most lasting effects were often not the battles, but the settlements that followed them. In the Danelaw, the northern men did not merely rule as a distant conquering class. They settled the land, farmed it, married into the local families, and put down roots. We can still hear them today in the very names of the places of northern and eastern England. For a great many towns and villages there carry names of Norse origin, names ending in the sounds the settlers brought with them, marking the farms and homesteads they founded more than 1,000 years ago. We can hear them too in the English language itself, which absorbed a whole layer of everyday words from the tongue of the northern settlers. Words so common now that we never think of them as borrowed at all. Ordinary words for ordinary things, woven so deeply into English that they have become the plain speech of every day. This is worth pausing on, because it shows how conquest and settlement, terrible as they often were in the moment, could over time become something else entirely, a mingling of peoples that produced not one culture or the other, but a new blend of both. The grandchildren of the men of the Great Army were not raiders from the sea, but farmers and townsfolk of England, speaking a language that was slowly merging with English, worshipping in Christian churches, and thinking of the land as their home. The frontier that Alfred had drawn did not last as a permanent border, for in the generations after him his descendants, above all his son and his grandsons, gradually extended the rule of Wessex northward, bringing the Danelaw under their authority, and in doing so, forging for the first time something like a single kingdom of England out of the old scattered realms. In a strange and roundabout way, the coming of the Norsemen had helped to create the very country that would resist them, for it was in the long struggle against the northern armies that the separate English kingdoms were finally welded into one. While these things unfolded in England, a parallel story was playing out across the sea in Ireland, and it took a rather different shape. Ireland in this age was not a single kingdom, but a land of many small kingdoms and shifting alliances, without any one great power like Wessex to unite resistance. Into this world, the northern men came, first as raiders striking at the rich monasteries for which Ireland was famous, and then as settlers who did something the Irish had never done before. They built towns. The Irish had lived in a world of scattered farms, monasteries, and royal strongholds, without true cities, and it was the Norsemen who founded, along the Irish coasts and rivers, the first real trading towns of the island. The greatest of these grew at a sheltered harbor on the east coast, a settlement that would become the city of Dublin, along with other towns whose names still mark the map of Ireland today. These towns became busy centers of trade, linking Ireland into the wider northern trading world, dealing in silver and slaves and goods of every kind. And they endured and grew long after the Viking Age itself had passed, so that some of Ireland's greatest cities trace their origins to these northern foundations. In Ireland, as in England, the northern settlers did not remain apart forever. They fought the Irish kings, and allied with them, and married into their families, and over generations the sharp line between the newcomers and the native people softened and blurred. The Norse of the Irish towns became a people of mixed blood and mixed culture, at home in Ireland, yet still linked by trade and kinship to the wider northern world. By the early 11th century, their political power in Ireland had been broken in a great battle, remembered in Irish tradition as a turning point, though as so often the reality was more tangled than the later legend, and the northern presence in the towns endured well beyond it. Here again, the deepest legacy was not conquest, but the founding of cities and the mingling of peoples. Now let us turn from the Western Islands and follow a different set of ships, sailing not west but south, along the coasts of the Frankish Empire. For here the story took yet another turn, and produced one of the most remarkable outcomes of the whole age. The Frankish Empire, which under the great Charlemagne had spread across much of Western Europe, was, by the 9th century, weakening and dividing among his heirs, and its long coastlines and great rivers lay open to the northern fleets. Up the rivers of what is now France the ships came, striking deep inland, even reaching the walls of the great city of Paris, which they besieged. The Frankish kings, unable to defeat the raiders outright and desperate to protect their lands, sometimes chose to buy them off with great payments of silver. A strategy that brought peace for a time, but also taught the northern men that pressure could be turned into profit. And then, in the early 10th century, a Frankish king tried a bolder and more lasting solution. Rather than merely paying the northern men to leave, he offered their leader something greater. He granted him land, a stretch of territory along the northern coast around the mouth of the river Seine, on the condition that the northern leader accept the Christian faith, acknowledge the king as his lord, and defend the coast against other raiders. In effect, the poacher was made the gamekeeper, and the raiders were transformed into settlers with a legitimate claim to the land they held. The northern leader accepted, was baptized, and settled his followers in the territory. That land took its name from the northern men who now held it, for it came to be called the land of the Northmen, the Normans, and the region is known to this day as Normandy. The story of Normandy is one of the most striking examples of how completely the Norsemen could transform themselves within the lands where they settled. Within a few generations, the descendants of these northern warriors had become thoroughly French in language, in faith, and in much of their culture, while keeping a certain restless energy and a talent for war and rule that marked them out. They became devout Christians, great builders of churches and monasteries, and formidable soldiers. And in time, from this small coastal territory, the Normans would go out to shape the history of Europe far beyond their homeland. Most famously when their duke crossed the sea in the year 1066 to claim the crown of England, winning it in a single great battle, and setting in motion changes that would reshape that kingdom forever. It is one of history's quiet ironies that the conquest of England in 1066, often thought of as the end of the Viking Age in England, was itself carried out by the descendants of Norsemen, so that in a sense the northern men returned to England twice, first as raiders and settlers of the Danelaw, and then generations later as the French-speaking Normans who would give England a new ruling class. Let us step back for a moment from these movements of armies and kings, and remember, as we always should, the ordinary people who lived through all of this, for the great events of history were always, for those who lived them, a matter of daily life, of families and farms and fear and hope. When a fleet appeared off a coast, or an army wintered in a valley, it was ordinary farmers and townsfolk and monks who felt it most, in the loss of a harvest, the burning of a home, the seizing of a loved one, or the sudden arrival of strange new neighbors who spoke a different tongue and worshipped, at first, different gods. And when the fighting gave way to settlement, it was again ordinary people who did the slow work of living together. The marriages across the old divide, the sharing of fields and markets, the raising of children who would grow up knowing both worlds and belonging fully to neither, until in time the division itself was forgotten and only the mingled people remained. We can catch glimpses of these ordinary lives in the things they left behind, and in the words that later ages wrote down. We find their houses in the earth, long timber halls and smaller homes, with their central hearths and their storage pits in the bones of their animals. We find their tools and their jewelry, their combs and their keys, their brooches and their beads. We find their graves, some simple and some rich, and from these we learn how they honored their dead and what they believed lay beyond. In the settled lands of England and Ireland and Normandy, we find the slow blending of northern and native ways in the very objects of daily life. in styles of ornament that mixed the old northern art with new Christian imagery, in stone crosses carved with both Christian saints and scenes from the old northern myths, as if the makers were standing with one foot in each world, which indeed they were. That mingling of the old faith and the new is one of the quiet, profound threads of this whole age, and it deserves a moment of our attention, told gently and with respect for all who lived it. When the Norsemen first went out into the wider world, they carried their own gods with them, Odin and Thor and the rest, and they came into lands that were, for the most part, already Christian, whose monasteries and churches they at first plundered, but as they settled among Christian peoples, married Christian wives, and made their lives in Christian lands, the new faith slowly reached them, not usually by force, but by the gradual pull of the world around them, by marriage and trade, and the desire to belong. A northern lord who wished to deal as an equal with Christian kings found it easier to do so as a fellow Christian. And baptism was often part of the settlements that turned raiders into rulers. Over time, this same tide of change reached back into the northern homelands themselves. And here too, the story is one of slow transformation, rather than sudden rupture. Christian missionaries traveled into Scandinavia, and Christian ideas came home with traders and returning warriors. And gradually, kingdom by kingdom and generation by generation, the peoples of the north turned from the old gods to the new faith. The change was not always smooth, and there was resistance in places. And for a long time, the old ways and the new lived side by side, so that a man might wear a hammer of Thor and a cross of Christ at the same time, hedging his devotion between the old world and the new. But the direction of the change was steady, and by the end of the Viking Age, the northern lands had become Christian kingdoms, with churches rising where the old sacred groves had stood, and the old gods slowly passing from living worship into memory and story. It is one of the gentle mercies of history that so much of the old northern world was not lost in this change, but preserved, and preserved remarkably, by the very people who had adopted the new faith. Far out in the Atlantic, on the island of Iceland, which the Norsemen had settled during these same centuries, the descendants of the settlers, now Christian, felt a deep love for the tales and poems of their ancestors, and they wrote them down. It is largely thanks to these Icelandic scholars, working centuries after the events, that we know the old myths of Odin and Thor, the long family stories of the settlers, and much of the poetry of the North. That a Christian people would lovingly preserve the pagan stories of their forefathers tells us something tender about human memory, about the way a people can turn from an old belief, and yet hold on to the beauty of it, keeping the stories safe even as the faith behind them fades. And so, across the western half of their world, in England and Ireland and Normandy and beyond, the Norsemen followed the same long arc, again and again, in different lands in different ways. They came first, as raiders out of the sea, feared and unpredictable. They stayed as settlers, founding towns, farming land, and putting down roots. They mingled with the people they had come among, marrying into their families, learning their languages, and slowly adopting their faith. And in the end, they became not a separate people apart, but a part of the lands they had entered, so woven into the fabric of England and Ireland and France that their descendants ceased to think of themselves as northern men at all, and only the place names, the borrowed words, the old graves, and the carved stones remained to whisper where they had come from. But the Norsemen did not travel only west and south. There was another great road open to them, a road not of the sea but of the rivers, running eastward and southward through the vast forests and plains of the east, toward lands and cities of astonishing wealth and grandeur. Along that road, other northern men were traveling in these same centuries, and their story is different again, stranger and in some ways even more remarkable, reaching all the way to the greatest city of the Christian East and beyond, to the very edge of the world the Norsemen knew. That eastern road is where our journey turns next. But let it wait for now, for there is no need to hurry down it tonight. Let the ships rest again on their far shores, in the harbors of Dublin and the rivers of Normandy and the wide fields of the Danelaw, where the northern men have laid down their weapons and taken up the plough. Let the stone crosses stand quiet in the English rain, carved with the old gods and the new. and let the firelight fade in 1,000 halls where two peoples have become one. Rest here a while in the long, slow twilight of the settling age, and we will follow the eastern road together when you are ready to go on. And so the story moves quietly forward once more, turning now away from the western seas and toward the great inland road of rivers and forests that carried the northern men eastward into a world so different from the coasts of Britain and Ireland that it might almost have belonged to another people entirely. For while some Norsemen sailed west toward the setting sun, others turned their prows east and south, following the rivers of the eastern lands down toward warmer waters and older civilizations. And their journey would take them further from home, in miles and in strangeness, than any of their kinsmen who raided the monasteries of the west. To understand this eastern road, we must first understand the geography that made it possible. For here again it was the land and the water that shaped everything. East of the Baltic Sea lay an enormous country of forest and plain, threaded through by great slow rivers that ran for hundreds of miles across the face of the land. These rivers were the highways of the East, for in a country of endless forest with few roads, the fastest and surest way to travel was by water, and the northern men, with their shallow drafted ships that could be rowed up a river, and when the water ran out, hauled overland to the next river, were perfectly suited to travel these highways. From the Baltic shore, a determined crew could work their way up one river system, carry their ships across the land between, and come down another river system flowing south, until at last they reached the warm seas of the south and the great cities that stood upon their shores. Two of these river roads mattered above all others. One led south toward a vast inland sea, and beyond it to the greatest Christian city in the world. The other led southeast toward another sea, and beyond it to the rich lands of the Islamic Caliphate. Along both roads the northern men traveled, and along both they found not empty wilderness, but peoples and towns and trade. And it was into this eastern world that they came, at first as traders and raiders much as in the west, and then, as in the west, as settlers and rulers who would in time be absorbed into the lands they had entered. The northern men who took the eastern road were known by a particular name in these lands, a name whose origin scholars still debate, but which came to be attached to them, and eventually to the whole vast country they helped to shape. They were called, in the sources of the East, the Rus. And from that name, over the long centuries, would come the name of Russia itself, so that the country that would one day be the largest on earth carried, in its very name, an echo of the northern men who had come down its rivers more than 1,000 years before. We must be careful here, for this is a matter that has stirred deep feelings and long argument among scholars, and the exact role of the northern men in the founding of the eastern state is debated to this day, with some emphasizing the Scandinavian element, and others the native Slavic peoples among whom they settled. What seems clear is that northern men were present and important in the early centuries of that world, that they traveled and traded and ruled along its rivers, and that they quickly mingled with the Slavic population and were absorbed into it, so that within a few generations the ruling families of the East, though they may have carried northern blood and northern names, had become Slavic in language and culture, much as their cousins in Normandy had become French. The heart of this eastern trade was the movement of goods along the rivers, and it was a trade of enormous reach and value. Down the rivers from the north came the products of the forest. Above all furs, the soft, rich pelts of northern animals that were prized in the southern markets, along with honey, wax, amber, and once again in that dark and constant trade of the age, captured people sold into slavery. And back up the rivers came silver. Above all silver, the metal the northern men craved, minted into coins in the great cities of the Islamic world far to the south and east, and carried north in astonishing quantities. The scale of this silver trade is one of the quiet marvels of the age, for the coins turn up by the many thousands in the hoards buried across the northern lands. Coins struck in distant southern cities, carried hand to hand across thousands of miles of river and forest and plain, until they came to rest at last in the earth of a cold northern island, where a farmer had buried his wealth and never returned to dig it up. To travel these rivers was no easy thing, and the sources that survive give us vivid glimpses of the hardships and dangers of the road on the great river that led south toward the Christian city. There were places where the water broke into wild rapids, stretches of churning white water, and jagged rock where no ship could safely pass. At these places, the crews had to unload their ships, carry the goods along the bank, and either haul the empty ships overland or ease them through the shallows by hand, all the while watching the surrounding country for the nomadic raiders who knew that this was where the river merchants were most vulnerable. A learned account written in the great southern city has come down to us describing these rapids one by one, giving each its name and telling how the merchants passed them. And reading it now, we can feel the labor and the fear of that passage. The men straining at the ships in the cold water, the lookouts watching the tree line, the relief when the rapids were behind them, and the smooth water lay ahead once more. At the end of the southern river road lay a sight that must have amazed the men of the north beyond all telling. For there stood the greatest city in the Christian world, the capital of the surviving Roman Empire of the East, which the northern men called by a name of their own, Miklagard, meaning simply the great city. And great it was, beyond anything in the experience of a man from a northern farm or a wooden trading town. It was a city of perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, ringed by mighty walls, crowned with domes and palaces, its markets overflowing with the goods of the whole known world, its churches shining with gold and mosaic. Its greatest church, an enormous domed building that had stood for centuries, was a wonder that could make a visitor from a simpler world feel that he had glimpsed heaven itself. To a northern man who had grown up among timber halls and turf-roofed farms, this city of stone and gold and marble must have seemed almost beyond belief, a vision from the world of the gods made real. The northern men came to this great city first, as they came everywhere, in ships and with mixed intentions, and more than once their fleets appeared on the water before the city's walls, hoping to plunder its fabulous wealth. But the great city was far too strong to be taken by such raids, protected by its walls, its fleet, and a terrifying weapon that the northern men had never seen before, a kind of liquid fire that the defenders could spray upon attacking ships, and that would burn even upon the water, a weapon whose exact secret the Empire guarded so closely that it is not fully understood even now. And so, unable to conquer the great city, the northern men did with it what they had learned to do elsewhere. They traded with it. Agreements were made, setting out the terms by which the northern merchants could enter the city, where they might lodge, how they might sell their goods, and by which the two worlds could deal with one another in peace, rather than in war. And out of this contact came one of the most extraordinary and evocative episodes of the whole Viking Age. For the northern men did not only trade with the great city, some of them came to serve it. The emperors of the East, always in need of loyal and formidable soldiers, came to prize the northern warriors for their strength, their courage, and, above all, their loyalty, which was less entangled in the politics and intrigues of the capital than that of local troops. And so there grew up, in the service of the Eastern Emperor, a body of northern warriors who became his personal guard, an elite corps known to history as the Varangian Guard. These were men of the north, and later also from the northern settled lands of the British Isles, who had traveled all that immense distance down the rivers to serve as the household soldiers of the emperor in the greatest city in the world. Imagine for a moment the strangeness and the wonder of such a life. A young man born on a farm in the far north, who had grown up among snow and fjords and the telling of old tales by the winter fire, might in the course of his life travel down the great rivers, past the dangerous rapids, cross the inland sea, and come at last to stand guard in shining armor and with a great axe upon his shoulder, in the golden halls of the Emperor of the Romans, in a city older and grander than anything his ancestors had ever imagined. Some of these men grew rich in the emperor's service and returned home to the north with their wealth and their stories. And we know that at least some of them left their mark in the most literal way, for high up in the great church of the eastern city, scratched into the marble of a railing where a bored guardsman must once have stood through the long hours of a ceremony. There survives to this day a piece of northern writing, the runes spelling out a northern name. It is a small human trace left by a man from the north in the heart of the great city, more than 1,000 years ago. To think of that inscription is to feel the whole vast reach of the Viking world in a single small and human detail. One man's name idly carved, surviving all these centuries to tell us that he was truly there. The eastern road then connected the cold farms of the north with the golden city of the south, and along it flowed not only silver and furs and warriors but ideas, and among those ideas was faith, for it was in part from the great Christian city of the east that the Christian faith came to the eastern Slavic world that the northern men had helped to shape. In the late 10th century, the ruler of the eastern realm chose to accept Christianity in its eastern form, the form practiced in the great city, and with that choice the vast lands of the east were set upon a path that would shape their culture, their art, their writing, and their faith for 1,000 years and more. The domes and icons and chants of the Eastern Church, the very alphabet in which the Eastern Slavic languages would be written, all flowed from this connection between the northern founded realm of the east and the great Christian city to the south. Here again, as everywhere in the Viking story, the movement of restless northern men along the water roads had consequences that reached far beyond anything they could have intended, helping to knit together worlds that would otherwise have remained apart. Some of the northern travelers went even further than the great Christian city, following the other eastern river road down toward the lands of the Islamic Caliphate, to the shores of another inland sea, and beyond, into the world of the Arab and Persian merchants and the wealthy cities of the Islamic East. And it is from this world that we have one of the most precious of all the accounts of the Norsemen. For a learned traveler from the Arab world encountered a party of northern merchants along a great river far from their home, and he wrote down what he saw of them, describing their appearance, their customs, their trade, and their beliefs with the careful curiosity of an educated man observing a strange and foreign people. His account is one of the very few descriptions of the Norsemen, written by an outsider who was neither a frightened monk nor a distant chronicler, but a thoughtful observer who watched them closely and set down what he saw. Through his eyes we glimpse the northern men as they appeared to a stranger from a more ancient and sophisticated civilization, tall and fair and heavily armed, tattooed, adorned with silver, engaged in their trade and their rituals along the riverbank. And though some of what he described was hard for him to understand and troubling to his own sensibilities, his account remains a rare and vivid window into a world that has otherwise left us mostly stone and bone and the words of its enemies. Let us pause here and reflect on the sheer astonishing reach of it all, for it is easy to say the words but harder to truly feel their meaning. Within the span of 2 or 3 centuries, a scattered people from the cold edges of northern Europe, who had begun as farmers and fishermen in a hard and isolated land, had sailed west to Britain and Ireland, and founded cities and kingdoms there. They had settled the coast of France, and given rise to the Normans, who would conquer England and much else besides. They had crossed the open Atlantic to islands no European had inhabited. They had traveled east down the great rivers to found the beginnings of the vast realm that would become Russia, and had gone on from there to serve the emperor in the greatest city of the Christian world, and to trade in the markets of the Islamic East. From the icy shores of the far north to the golden domes of the southern city, from the misty islands of the west to the warm rivers of the east, the northern men had woven a web of travel and trade and settlement that spanned a great part of the known world, and they had done it in their remarkable ships, guided by their knowledge of the sea, driven by that restless northern hunger to go and to see and to take and to build. It is one of the great movements of peoples in all of history, and it was accomplished not by a great empire with vast resources, but by a loose and quarrelsome collection of chieftains, farmers, traders, and adventurers, each following his own path across the water. Yet, for all the drama of the raids and the voyages and the guardsmen in the Golden City, we must remember that the great majority of the northern people, in all these centuries, never traveled to the great city, or served an emperor, or crossed an ocean. They lived at home on their farms, in their valleys, and along their coasts. And it is to that home life that we should now gently return, for it is there that the true texture of the age is to be found, in the daily round of ordinary people whose names are almost all forgotten, but whose lives were the ground from which all the great voyages grew. Let us step, then, back into a northern farm at the height of the Viking Age, and spend a little while in the ordinary world of the people who lived there. For there is a deep comfort in the small and patient details of everyday life, and they will settle gently around us as the night deepens. The farm stands where farms always stood, on the best land that could be found, near water and shelter, with fields for the barley and the oats, meadows for the hay, and pasture for the animals. At the heart of the farm is the long hall, the great timber and turf building where the family lives, and around it stand the other buildings of the steading, the byre where the cattle are kept through the winter, the storehouses, the workshops, the small huts sunk into the ground where the women weave and work. The life of the farm turns, as it always did, upon the great wheel of the seasons. In the spring, when the snow melts and the ground softens, the fields must be plowed and sown, hard, heavy work with simple tools and the strength of oxen and men. Through the summer, the crops must be tended, the animals watched and moved to their pastures, the hay cut and dried and gathered in, for the hay is the life of the animals through the long winter, and a poor hay harvest means hungry beasts and hard choices when the cold comes. In the autumn comes the harvest, the gathering of the grain, and then the great reckoning of the year, the slaughtering of the animals that cannot be kept through the winter, the salting and smoking and storing of meat, the brewing of ale, the laying up of everything that will carry the household through the dark months ahead. And then comes the winter, the long, dark, quiet time when the work turns inward, to the mending and the making, the spinning and the weaving, the telling of stories by the fire, the waiting for the light to return. Within this round of the seasons, the household is a busy and self-sufficient world, for a farm in the northern lands had to make almost everything it needed for itself. The women of the household spun wool into thread and wove the thread into cloth, and from that cloth they made the clothing of the whole family, a task of enormous labor that occupied countless hours. For every garment, every sail, every blanket began as raw wool that had to be cleaned and combed and spun and woven and cut and sewn by hand. The making of cloth was so central to the life of the household, and so much of it fell to the women, that we should think of it as one of the great and unsung labors of the age, the patient, endless work of hands at the loom and the spindle, without which no one would have been clothed and no ship would have had a sail. The men worked the fields and tended the larger animals, and there were craftsmen too, smiths who worked iron into tools and weapons and nails, woodworkers who shaped the timber of the buildings and the boats, and all the many skills that a self-sufficient community required. The food of this world was simple and hearty, suited to a cold climate and a hard-working people. Bread was made from the barley and the oats and the rye, coarse dark bread that was the foundation of every meal. There was meat from the animals, beef and mutton and pork, much of it preserved by salting and smoking to last through the winter. There was fish, of course, in great quantity along the coasts and rivers, cod and herring and salmon, dried and salted for keeping. There was milk from the cattle and the goats, made into butter and cheese to preserve its goodness. There were the vegetables that would grow in the northern gardens, cabbages and onions and peas and beans. There were wild foods gathered from the land, berries and nuts, and the eggs of seabirds. And there was ale brewed from the barley, the drink of every feast and every gathering, poured into drinking horns and passed around the fire in the long hall on the winter nights. The house itself was a world of firelight and shadow, for there were no windows to speak of, only the fire in the long central hearth, and perhaps a few small openings to let out the smoke and let in a little air. The hearth was the heart of everything, the source of warmth and light and cooking, and the household lived and gathered around it. Along the walls ran the raised platforms where the family sat by day and slept by night, wrapped in wool and furs against the cold. The walls might be hung with woven cloth, both for warmth and for beauty, and the possessions of the household were stored in chests, and hung upon the walls. It was a dim and smoky world by our standards, but it was warm and close and safe, a small circle of firelight and family against the great cold dark of the northern winter. And there is something in it that speaks to the deepest human longing for home and shelter and belonging. Within this world, people were born and grew and married and had children and grew old and died, as people do everywhere. And though the sources tell us far more about the great men and their deeds than about the ordinary rhythm of family life, we can catch glimpses of the human relationships that filled these lives. Marriage was in part a matter of alliance between families, arranged with care and with attention to property and status, but it was also, we may hope and believe, often a matter of real partnership and affection. And the northern women, as we have seen, were figures of real authority and respect within the household and the community. Children were precious and were raised into the work and the ways of the farm from an early age, learning by doing, absorbing the skills and the stories and the values of their people. The old were honored for their wisdom and their memory, for in a world without writing it was the old who carried the knowledge of the law, the genealogies, the stories, and the accumulated experience of the generations. Death, in this world, was near and familiar, as it was everywhere before our own age of long lives and distant medicine. Many children died young, and childbirth was dangerous for women, and disease and accident and hunger and the sea took their steady toll. The northern people met death with the beliefs we have already touched upon, the old belief in the halls of the slain and the world of the dead, and later the Christian hope of heaven, and they honored their dead with care, burying them with the things they might need in the next world, sometimes in simple graves and sometimes, for the great and wealthy, in rich burials that have given us some of our most precious knowledge of their world. The great ship burials, where a powerful person was laid to rest in a whole ship, surrounded by treasures and provisions, and sometimes by sacrificed animals, speak to us of a deep belief in a journey beyond death, and of the honor and love with which the living sent their dead upon that journey. We should linger a little on the artistry of these people, for it is easy, amid the stories of raids and battles, to forget that the Norsemen were makers of great beauty, and that their art is one of the glories of the early medieval world. Their taste ran to intricate, interlacing patterns, to the shapes of animals and beasts woven together into complex and flowing designs that covered the objects of their daily life and their treasures alike. We see this art in the carved prows and timbers of their ships, in their jewelry of silver and gold, in the ornamental fittings of their weapons and their possessions, in the great carved stones they raised in memory of their dead. The northern craftsmen delighted in filling every surface with pattern, with the sinuous forms of gripping beasts and twining serpents, worked with a skill and a confidence that still take the breath away. This was not the art of a crude or simple people, but of a sophisticated culture with a strong and distinctive aesthetic, an art that would blend in the settled and Christianized lands with the new imagery of the Christian world to produce works of striking beauty. And that remains one of the most recognizable and admired artistic traditions of the whole medieval age. And we should remember, too, the poetry, for the Norsemen were a people who loved words as much as they loved silver and ships. Poetry held a place of the highest honor in their culture, and the poet, the skald, who could compose intricate verses in praise of a lord or in memory of a great deed, was a valued and respected figure. Their poetry was demanding and complex, built upon elaborate rules of meter and upon a rich vocabulary of poetic phrases, in which a ship might be called the horse of the sea, or the sea the whales rode, or gold the fire of the river, so that the verses were woven through with these vivid and elusive images. Much of this poetry was preserved, like the myths, by the later scholars of Iceland, and through it we can still hear something of the voice of the northern world, its love of glory and its awareness of mortality, its pride and its dark humor and its deep feeling for the passing of all things. For beneath the surface of their fierce and active culture, the Norsemen carried a profound awareness of impermanence, a sense that fame and treasure and life itself were fleeting, and that the only thing that truly lasted was the memory of a person's name and deeds, kept alive in the words of the poets after they themselves were gone. There is a famous sentiment preserved in the old northern verses, a reflection that cattle die and kinsmen die and we ourselves must die. But that one thing never dies, and that is the reputation we leave behind, the memory of who we were and what we did. In that thought, we can perhaps see something of what drove so many of them out across the seas, the hunger not only for wealth, but for a name that would outlast them, a glory that would be remembered when they themselves had returned to the earth. Let us hold that thought gently, for it is a tender and a human one. And it connects these people so distant from us in time and in so many of their ways to something we all feel, the wish to matter, to be remembered, to leave some trace of ourselves behind when we are gone. The northern man who carved his name into the marble of the great southern city, the family who raised a carved stone in memory of a father lost at sea, the poet who wove a lord's deeds into verses that would be recited by the fire for generations, the woman who wove a great cloth that would clothe her children and her children's, all of them, in their different ways, were reaching for that same thing, for a small immortality of memory against the great forgetting of time. And in a strange way they have won it, for here we are, 1,000 years later and half a world away, speaking of them still, thinking of their farms and their ships and their gods and their words, so that their long ago hope of being remembered has against all odds quietly come true. There is a great comfort in this, I think, as the night deepens around us. The thought that a way of life so distant and so different from our own can still reach across the centuries and touch us. That the people who lived in those smoky halls and sailed those cold seas were, beneath all the differences of their age, human beings much like ourselves, who loved and feared and hoped and grieved, who worked hard and told stories and honored their dead and wished to be remembered. The great events of history, the raids and the battles and the founding of kingdoms, are the parts that get written down and argued over, but underneath them always lies this quieter and more universal story, the story of ordinary human lives lived out in a particular time and place. And it is this quieter story that stays with us, I think, and that settles most gently upon the mind at the end of the day. So let us rest here a while, in the warm, dim world of the northern farm, with the fire burning low in the long hall, and the snow lying deep and silent outside, and the wool being spun and the stories being told, and the ale being passed around the circle of firelight. Let the great voyages wait upon their distant seas, the ships resting in the harbors of the great city and the rivers of the east. Let the wheel of the seasons turn slowly, as it always did, through the sowing and the growing and the harvest and the long dark waiting for the light. There is no hurry here, and nothing you need to hold on to. The northern world is settling quietly around you, patient and old and near, and we will go on together, out across the open ocean to the far western islands, when you are ready. For there remains one last great chapter in the story of the northern voyages, and it is perhaps the most remarkable of all, for it carried the Norsemen not to the rich and settled lands of the east or the west, but out into the empty gray wastes of the open Atlantic, toward islands that no human being had ever seen, and, in the end, to a distant shore across the whole width of the ocean, a shore that Europe would reach again only after 5 long centuries, and would then remember as a discovery, forgetting that other men in other ships had stood upon it long before. That is the story that waits for us now, the story of the great western voyages of Iceland and Greenland and the land beyond the sunset, and of the ordinary families who sailed out into the unknown ocean in their open ships, carrying their animals and their tools and their hopes toward a new life at the very edge of the world. But it is a story to tell slowly in its own time, and the night is long, and there is no need to reach it all at once. For now, let the fire burn low, and the sea lie quiet beyond the fjords, and the whole northern world rest in the deep peace of the winter dark. Let the ships sleep on their beaches and the halls fall silent, and the stars turn slowly overhead, cold and clear above the mountains and the snow. Rest here in the warmth and the stillness, and we will sail out onto the wide ocean together when the time comes. And so, when you are ready, let us leave the sheltered fjords and the busy trading towns behind, and turn our faces toward the open ocean toward the west, where the sea stretched away gray and endless beyond the last known land, and where the boldest of the northern voyagers would sail into waters no one had ever crossed, toward islands waiting empty at the edge of the world. This is the story of the Great Western Voyages, and it is a story unlike the others we have followed, for it was not a tale of raiding rich monasteries or trading in golden cities, but of ordinary families sailing out into the unknown, carrying their whole lives in open ships, to make new homes in lands that had never known a human footstep. To understand these voyages, we must first understand the sea itself as the northern men knew it, for they possessed a knowledge of the ocean that was, in its way, as remarkable as any of their achievements. They had no compass, no charts, none of the instruments that later sailors would rely upon, and yet they crossed vast stretches of open water, out of sight of land for days at a time, and found their way to tiny islands in the immensity of the Atlantic. How they did it is a matter that still fascinates those who study the age, and the answer lies in a deep and practical understanding of the natural world, built up over generations and passed from father to son and captain to crew. They knew the sun and the stars and could hold a course by them. They knew the winds and the currents and could read the character of the water. They watched the birds, for the flight of certain seabirds could tell an experienced sailor that land lay in a particular direction, and they watched the sea itself, the color of the water, the pattern of the waves, the presence of whales or driftwood or floating weed. They knew the great sea creatures and where they were found. They read the clouds, and the way clouds gather over unseen land. All of this knowledge, held in the memory of the sailors and never written down, allowed them to venture out onto the open ocean with a confidence that seems almost impossible to us now, and to find their way home again across the trackless water. The first great step out into the Atlantic came when the northern voyagers reached the islands that lay scattered in the northern seas and settled them one by one. There were the islands that clustered close to the northern coast of Britain, which the northern men took and settled so thoroughly that they became, for centuries, part of the northern world, rather than the British one, their people speaking a northern tongue and following northern ways. Further out lay other islands, windswept and treeless, out in the gray Atlantic, and these too the northern men found and settled, raising their sheep on the steep green slopes above the sea. Each of these settlements was a step further out into the ocean, a further reach into the unknown, and each prepared the way for the greater voyages still to come. And then, sometime in the 9th century, the voyagers came to an island larger than any they had settled before. A great island lying far out in the northern Atlantic, a land of ice and fire, of glaciers and volcanoes, of steaming hot springs and black lava fields and green valleys running down to the sea. This was Iceland, and its discovery and settlement is one of the best remembered episodes of the whole age for the people who settled it. And their descendants cared deeply about their own history and wrote much of it down so that we know more about the settling of Iceland than about almost any other part of the Viking world. According to the traditions that were later recorded, the island was found by chance, by voyagers blown off course, or searching for lands rumored to lie in the west, and word of it spread through the northern world that there was a great empty land out in the ocean, with room for farms and pastures and a new beginning. And so, through the later 9th century and into the 10th, families began to sail out to Iceland to settle it. In what the traditions remember as a great age of settlement, they came for many reasons, some in search of land in a homeland where good land was growing scarce, some fleeing conflicts, or the growing power of ambitious kings who were beginning, in these very years, to unite the scattered chieftaincies of the north into larger kingdoms and to demand the submission of men who had been used to their independence. There is a strong thread in the Icelandic tradition that many of the settlers were people who valued their freedom and their independence, who did not wish to bow to a king, and who sailed out to the empty island to build a society where they could govern themselves. And whether or not this was true of every settler, there is something in it that seems to have shaped the character of the Icelandic settlement, for the society they built was one without a king, a commonwealth of free farmers governing themselves by law and by assembly. Imagine the courage and the hope of such a voyage, for it is worth dwelling on. A family would load everything they owned and needed into an open ship, their tools and their goods, their seed grain for planting, and, most remarkably, their animals, their cattle and sheep and horses and pigs, packed into the open vessel for a voyage of many days across the open ocean. They would sail out from the land they knew, out past the last islands, out onto the wide gray sea, trusting to their knowledge of the water and the stars and the birds, and to their courage and their luck to carry them across to the new land. Some surely did not make it, lost in the great storms of the northern Atlantic. Their fate never known, but many did make it, and came at last to the shores of the new island, and found their way to a stretch of empty land where they might build a farm and begin a new life. And there they unloaded their ship and their animals and their hopes and set to work. The society they built in Iceland is one of the most fascinating in all of history, and it deserves our quiet attention, for it shows us the northern people, not as raiders or conquerors, but as builders of a whole new world from the ground up. They found the island empty of other people, save perhaps for a few Irish hermits who had come there before them seeking solitude, and so they had to make everything themselves, to divide up the land, to establish farms, to work out how they would live together and settle their disputes and govern their affairs. And the answer they arrived at was law for the Icelanders. Like all the northern peoples, held law in the deepest respect, and they built their whole society upon it. They established a great assembly, held each year at a striking place of cliffs and lava, where a natural rock wall formed a kind of platform. And there, once a year, the free men of the whole island would gather to make and declare the law, to settle disputes, to conduct the business of the Commonwealth, and to meet and trade and marry and renew the bonds of their scattered society. This assembly, which they called the Althing, is remembered as one of the oldest continuing parliamentary institutions in the world, for the tradition of that annual gathering has continued, in one form or another, from the 10th century down to the present day, so that the Parliament of modern Iceland traces its ancestry directly back to those gatherings on the lava plain more than 1,000 years ago. There was no king in this commonwealth, and no central government in the way we would understand it, but there was law spoken aloud each year by a man chosen to remember and recite it. And there were the chieftains and the assemblies and the whole intricate web of obligation and custom by which the free farmers of the island governed themselves. It was not a perfect society, and it had its feuds and its violence and its injustices, and in the end it would prove unable to hold itself together and would pass, centuries later, under the rule of a foreign king. But for a long time it endured, a self-governing commonwealth of free farmers at the edge of the world, and it stands as a remarkable achievement, a whole society built by ordinary people upon the twin foundations of law and the land. And it is to Iceland, above all, that we owe the preservation of so much of the northern world's memory, for the Icelanders became, in the centuries after their conversion to Christianity, a people of extraordinary literary achievement, who wrote down the stories of their ancestors, the myths of the old gods, the poetry of the skalds, and, above all, the great prose stories that we call the sagas. The sagas are one of the treasures of world literature, long and often deeply moving accounts of the lives of the settlers and their descendants, of their feuds and their friendships, their loves and their quarrels, their journeys and their deaths, told in a plain, spare, and powerful style that can still grip a reader today. They are not simple histories, and scholars debate carefully how much of what they record is true memory and how much is later shaping and invention, but they are windows, however imperfect, into the world and the values and the imagination of the northern people, and without them our picture of the whole age would be immeasurably poorer. That a small society of farmers at the edge of the ocean should have produced such a body of literature is one of the quiet wonders of the age. And it reminds us again that these were a people who loved words and stories and memory as much as they loved the sea and the silver and the ship. But Iceland was not the end of the western voyages for the northern hunger to go further, to see what lay beyond the next horizon, drove some of them onward still, out past Iceland into waters even more remote and forbidding. And here the story attaches itself to a particular family and a particular man, remembered in the sagas, a man known by a name that speaks of his fiery temperament, who was driven out of Iceland after a violent quarrel, and having nowhere else to go, sailed west into the unknown ocean in search of a land that others had glimpsed or guessed at, lying somewhere out in the west. And he found it, a vast land of ice and rock, and along its southern coasts, some green and habitable valleys where a farm might be made. He explored it during his years of exile, and when his term of banishment was over, he returned to Iceland and told of the new land he had found, and in what the sagas remember as a deliberate act of persuasion, he gave it an appealing name, calling it the Greenland, Greenland, in the hope of drawing settlers to follow him there. And follow him they did, for a fleet of ships set out to settle the new land. And though the sagas remember that many were lost on the hard crossing, enough came through to establish, on the green coasts of that immense and icy land, a new northern colony, further out into the ocean than any before. The Greenland settlement is a story touched with a particular poignancy, for it was a colony living at the very edge of what was possible, clinging to a narrow strip of habitable coast, beneath the great ice, thousands of miles from the northern homeland, dependent on the sea for its links to the wider world. The settlers built their farms and raised their animals, and hunted the seals and the walruses and the great creatures of the northern seas. And they traded the precious walrus ivory and the furs and the ropes back to Europe. And for a while the colony flourished, growing to a population of several thousand people, with its farms and its churches and its own bishop, a Christian community of northern folk living out their lives at the world's frozen edge. But it was always a fragile thing, and in the end, after some 4 centuries, the Greenland colony would fade and die, its people gone, its farms abandoned to the cold. For reasons that historians still debate, a cooling climate that made the hard land harder still, the failing of the trade that linked it to Europe, the pressure of the native peoples of the Arctic who were moving into the region, and perhaps a failure to adapt their old European ways to the harsh realities of their new home. The slow dying of the Greenland colony is one of the quiet tragedies of the age. A whole community simply fading away at the edge of the world, unremembered and unmourned, until only the ruins of their farms and churches remained beneath the Arctic sky, and even the memory of exactly how they ended was lost. But before that long fading, while the Greenland colony was still young and full of hope, its people took the last and greatest step of all, the step that carried the northern voyagers across the whole width of the ocean to a new continent, to the shores of what we now call North America, some 5 centuries before the voyages that Europe would later remember as the discovery of the New World. The story, as the sagas remember it, began with a ship blown off course on its way to Greenland, whose crew sighted, far to the west, the shores of an unknown land, wooded and low, quite unlike the icy coasts of Greenland, before they turned back without landing. Word of this sighting spread through the Greenland colony, and in time voyages were made to explore and to reach these new western lands. Expeditions led, the sagas tell us, by the sons and family of the man who had settled Greenland and by others of the colony. And so the northern men came at last to the shores of North America, and they explored some stretch of its coast, finding lands they named for their qualities, a land of flat stones, a land of forests, and, most famously, a land they called Vinland, the land of vines or of wine. So named, the sagas say, for the wild grapes or berries they found growing there, a sign of a warmer and richer country than the icy lands they had left behind. They found a country of forests and rivers and meadows, of good pasture and abundant fish and timber. Timber above all, for the treeless Greenland colony was always desperate for wood, and here was a land of endless forest. And they tried, according to the sagas, to establish a settlement there, to build houses and to winter in the new land, and perhaps to make a lasting colony as they had done in Iceland and Greenland. But the North American venture did not last, and the reasons the sagas give are ones that ring true. The new land was already inhabited, for the northern men encountered the native peoples of North America, whom they called by a name of their own, and relations between the two, uneasy from the start, turned to conflict, and the small parties of northern settlers, far from home and few in number, could not hope to hold their ground against the people whose land it was. And the land was simply too far away, too remote from the tiny and struggling Greenland colony that was itself thousands of miles from the northern world, too distant to be supported and supplied and defended. And so, after a few voyages and a brief attempt at settlement, the northern men withdrew from North America, and the memory of their voyages there survived only in the sagas, in stories that later ages long dismissed as mere legend. Tales too fantastic to be believed, of northern men reaching a continent that Europe would not encounter again for 500 years. For a long time then, the story of the northern voyages to North America was regarded as no more than a legend, a colorful tale in the old Icelandic stories with no foundation in fact. But in the middle of the 20th century, on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in Canada, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a settlement, the traces of turf buildings of unmistakably northern type, along with objects and evidence that showed beyond doubt that northern men from across the Atlantic had indeed lived there 1,000 years ago. The discovery confirmed what the sagas had remembered, that the northern voyagers had truly reached North America, had truly built at least one settlement on its shores, and had truly stood upon the soil of the new continent long before any other Europeans. It is one of the most thrilling confirmations in all of archaeology, the moment when an old story long dismissed as legend was shown to hold a core of solid truth, and it stands as a monument to the astonishing reach of the northern voyagers, who in their open ships, guided only by their knowledge of the sea and the sky, had crossed the whole width of the northern ocean from the fjords of Scandinavia to the shores of America, in a great chain of voyages spanning the entire Atlantic. Think for a moment of the full sweep of it as it settles quietly in the mind. From the homeland in Scandinavia, the northern voyagers had reached out across the sea to the islands of the north, and then to Iceland, and then to Greenland, and then, at last, to North America, each settlement a further reach into the unknown, each a base from which the next leap could be made, until the whole width of the northern Atlantic had been spanned by northern ships and northern farms, and they had done it not as a great state-organized enterprise, but as the cumulative work of individual families and small groups, sailing out in their open ships with their animals and their tools and their hopes, driven by the hunger for land and freedom and the restless northern love of the open sea. It is one of the great feats of exploration and endurance in all of human history, and it was accomplished quietly without fanfare, by ordinary people whose names, in most cases, we will never know, who simply loaded their ships and sailed out into the gray unknown to make new lives at the edge of the world. And yet, for all its wonder, this greatest reach of the northern voyages was also, in a sense, its high water mark, the furthest point of the tide before it began to turn. The North American settlement was abandoned almost as soon as it was made. The Greenland colony, that furthest outpost, would flourish for a while, and then slowly fade and die. And in the northern homelands themselves, and across the whole northern world, great changes were underway that would, over the course of the 11th century, bring the Viking Age gradually to its close, and transform the restless raiding and voyaging people of the north into the settled Christian kingdoms of medieval Scandinavia, taking their place among the ordinary nations of Europe. The age of the great voyages was not ended by any single defeat or disaster, but faded slowly as the conditions that had produced it changed, and as the northern world itself was changed from within. To understand how the age drew to its close, we must return from the far western ocean to the northern homelands, and see what had been happening there, while the voyagers sailed and settled. For all through the Viking Age, even as the fleets went out to raid and trade and settle, the northern lands themselves had been changing, slowly consolidating from the old patchwork of small chieftaincies and local powers into larger and more organized kingdoms. Ambitious leaders had been fighting and maneuvering and allying to bring more and more territory under their control, to make themselves kings over whole regions rather than lords of a single valley or district. And by the end of the age this process had produced, in place of the old fragmented north, the beginnings of the three kingdoms that would endure into the modern world, the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This gathering of power into the hands of kings had much to do with the ending of the Viking Age, for it changed the very conditions that had produced the raids and the voyages. In the old days, a chieftain's power had rested on his ability to reward his followers, and raiding and trading abroad had been ways of gaining the wealth and the glory needed to build and hold that power. But as strong kings emerged and consolidated their rule, the freewheeling independence of the old raiding chieftains was steadily curtailed, and the kings, wishing to control the violence and channel the energies of their people toward their own purposes, brought the age of freelance raiding under increasing restraint. At the same time, the rise of these Christian kingdoms was bound up with the coming of Christianity to the north, which we touched upon earlier, for the new kings often embraced the new faith as part of their state building, and Christian kingship brought with it new ideas of order and rule that had little room for the old ways of the sea raider. And so the raiding energies of the north were gradually turned inward into the building of kingdoms and churches, or channeled into more organized and royal forms of warfare, until the old pattern of the small independent raid, striking out of the sea and vanishing again, faded away. The wider world, too, had changed in ways that made the old raiding harder and less rewarding. The lands that had once lain open and undefended before the northern fleets had learned, over the long generations of the raids, to defend themselves. Kings and lords across Europe had built fortifications, organized their defenses, learned to guard their coasts and rivers, so that the easy plunder of the early years was no longer to be had. The very success of the Norsemen in settling and mingling with the peoples of Europe had, in a sense, worked against the continuation of the raids, for the settled and Christianized descendants of the raiders had become part of the European world, no longer raiders but Christian lords and farmers and townsfolk, with as much reason to fear a raid as anyone. The world that the early raiders had exploited, a world of scattered and undefended wealth, lying open to swift attack from the sea, had passed away, transformed in part by the very impact of the northern men themselves. The 11th century saw the last great flourishing of northern power, and also, in a way, its final chapter, for in this century, northern kings still played great roles upon the European stage. There was a period when a powerful northern king ruled over a great sea empire that included Denmark, England, and Norway, a remarkable dominion that showed the heights the northern kingdoms could still reach, though it did not long survive its founder. And the year 1066, so famous in the history of England, saw not one but two great invasions, for even as the English king faced the threat of the Normans from the south, he had first to march north to defeat a great invasion led by a northern king who had come to claim the English throne in the old way, by force of arms and ships. That northern king was defeated and killed in a great battle in the north of England, and his defeat is often remembered as marking the end of the old age of northern invasions of England, for after him no more great northern fleets came to conquer, and the northern king who fell there was, in a sense, the last of the great Viking warlords to attempt the old dream of conquest across the sea. That the same year saw the victory of the Normans, the descendants of Norsemen who had settled in France and become French, is one of history's quiet symmetries, for it marked at once the ending of one form of the northern story and the triumph of another, the raider giving way to the settled and transformed descendant, the old world of the sea kings passing into the new world of medieval Christian Europe. And so the Viking Age drew slowly to its close, not with a single ending but with a long and gradual transformation, as the raiding and voyaging people of the north settled into the ordinary life of medieval Europe. The northern lands became Christian kingdoms, with their churches and their bishops and their kings ruling in the manner of other European monarchs. The old gods faded from worship into story and memory, preserved in the writings of the Icelanders, but no longer prayed to or sacrificed to. The great ships still sailed, but for trade and for the ordinary business of the sea, rather than for the old raids. The descendants of the settlers in England and Ireland and Normandy and the East became simply English and Irish and French and Slavic, their northern origins fading into the deep background of their people's histories, remembered, if at all, in place names and borrowed words and old family stories. The distant colonies faded, Greenland slowly dying at the edge of the ice, the memory of North America surviving only in the sagas until the archaeologists confirmed it 1,000 years later. And the restless, expansive energy that had carried the northern men across half the world was spent, or rather transformed, absorbed into the ordinary life of the nations that the Norsemen had helped, in their wandering and their settling, to shape. Yet, the ending of the Viking Age was not truly an ending, for the northern men had left their mark upon the world in ways too deep to be undone, and their legacy would endure long after the last raiding ship had been drawn up on the beach for the final time. We have already seen many of these legacies, the cities they founded in Ireland, the great realm of the East that carried their name, the Normans who reshaped England and much of Europe besides, the words they left in the English language, the place names scattered across the map of Northern Europe, and there were legacies deeper still, in the very shape of the nations that emerged from the age, in the kingdoms of Scandinavia that trace their origins to the consolidation of the Viking centuries, in the Parliament of Iceland with its roots in the assembly on the lava plain, in the whole web of connection and exchange that the northern men had woven across Europe and beyond, linking together worlds that had before been separate, carrying goods and ideas and peoples across the seas and the rivers of half the known world. But perhaps the deepest legacy of all, and the one that concerns us most on a quiet night such as this, is the memory of the northern world itself, preserved against all the odds by the love and the labor of those who came after, so that 1,000 years later we can still sit by the fire and speak of it and feel it near. For it would have been easy, so very easy, for the whole world of the Norsemen to have vanished almost without trace, remembered only as a vague terror in the frightened chronicles of the monks they had raided. Their own voice lost entirely, their gods and their poems and their stories gone forever into the silence of the past. And yet it was not so for the northern people, and above all the Icelanders cared enough about their own memory to preserve it, to write down the myths and the poems and the sagas, to keep alive the names and the deeds and the stories of their ancestors, so that the northern world, uniquely among so many of the vanished peoples of the past, still speaks to us in its own voice, still tells us its own stories, still shows us its own gods and heroes and ordinary folk across the great gulf of the centuries. And so, when we think of the Norsemen now, we need not think only of the raiders out of the sea, the shadows falling upon the monastery, the terror along the coasts. Though that was real, and we should not forget it, we can think also of the farmers in their long hauls, and the women at their looms, and the shipwrights shaping the beautiful curved timbers of their vessels, and the poets weaving their intricate verses by the winter fire, and the free farmers gathering at their assembly on the lava plain to make their law, and the families loading their animals into open ships to sail out across the unknown ocean toward new homes at the edge of the world. We can think of the young man from a northern farm standing guard in the golden city of the south, and idly carving his name into the marble where it survives to this day. We can think of the whole astonishing reach of it, from the fjords of the homeland to the shores of America, from the domes of the great southern city to the ice of Greenland, a scattered people from the cold edge of the world reaching out across the seas in their remarkable ships to touch, however briefly, a great part of the known world of their age. There is something in their story that stays with us, I think, and settles gently on the mind as the night deepens. It is the sense of a people who lived close to the hard realities of the world, who knew the cold and the dark and the danger of the sea and the nearness of death, and who yet met that hard world with courage and with artistry and with a deep love of words and stories and memory. It is the sense of their restlessness, that hunger to go and to see and to find what lay beyond the horizon, which carried them so far and cost so many of them their lives in the great gray ocean, and which is perhaps one of the deepest and most human of all our impulses, the longing to press on into the unknown. And it is the sense above all of their awareness of impermanence, their knowledge that all things pass, that cattle die and kinsmen die, and we ourselves must die, and that the only thing that endures is the memory we leave behind, The name and the deeds and the stories that outlast us, kept alive in the words of those who come after. In that awareness they were wiser, perhaps, than they knew, for their world did pass, as all worlds pass. The raiding ended, and the old gods faded, and the distant colonies died, and the restless energy was spent and absorbed into the ordinary life of Europe. And yet their memory endured against all the odds, kept alive by those who loved it, so that here we are, 1,000 years later, and half a world away, speaking of them still in the quiet of the night, thinking of their ships and their farms and their gods and their words, feeling them near across the great gulf of time. Their long ago hope of being remembered has quietly come true, and in that there is a comfort that reaches beyond their story to touch our own. The comfort of knowing that memory can outlast the passing of a whole world, that the things that seem most surely doomed to be forgotten can yet be kept and carried forward, that the light of a vanished world can still, in the quiet places of memory, be made to shine again. So let us rest now in that quiet light, as the night draws in around us and the story draws toward its close. Let the ships rest on their beaches for the last time, drawn up above the tide line, their sails furled, their voyaging done. Let the long halls fall silent, the fires burn down to embers, the household sleeping wrapped in wool against the northern cold. Let the assembly on the lava plain stand empty under the wide pale sky, the law spoken, and the year's business done. Let Greenland sleep beneath its ice, and Iceland beneath its stars, and the far shore of America lie quiet and forgotten beneath the forest, waiting for the centuries to pass. Let the whole northern world settle into the deep peace of the winter dark, the sea gray and patient beyond the fjords, the mountains white with snow, the aurora shifting green and silver far overhead. And so the story moves toward its quiet close, and there remains only to speak of what came after, of the long centuries in which the Norsemen passed out of living history and into memory, and of how that memory was kept and shaped and passed down through the ages until it reached us here, in the stillness of this night. For the ending of the Viking Age was not the ending of the northern people, who did not vanish but simply changed, becoming the settled Christian nations of medieval Scandinavia, and it was not the ending of their influence, which continued to work quietly through the centuries in the lands they had touched, but it was the ending of a particular chapter, the closing of the great age of the raids and the voyages, and after it the northern world took its place among the ordinary nations of Europe, and the extraordinary energy that had carried it across half the world settled into the slower rhythms of medieval life. Let us follow gently. What became of the different strands of the northern world in the centuries after the Great Age had passed? In the homelands of Scandinavia, the three kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden settled into their long medieval existence, Christian realms with their kings and their churches and their nobles, taking part in the wider affairs of Europe, sometimes powerful and sometimes weak, but no longer the source of a great outward movement of raiders and settlers. They built their cathedrals of stone where the old wooden temples had stood, and their kings were crowned with Christian rites, and their people worshipped in the churches and were buried in Christian graveyards, and the old gods survived only in the tales told for pleasure by the fire and in the writings preserved by the scholars. The northern kingdoms would have their later histories, their unions and their wars and their kings, their times of greatness and their times of trouble, but that is another story belonging to a later age, and it need not detain us now. What matters for our tale is that the homelands endured, that the northern people went on, transformed but continuous, and that the land of the fjords and the forests and the long winters remained the home of a northern people down to our own day. In the lands the Norsemen had settled abroad, the process of absorption that had begun during the age itself continued to its completion, until the northern settlers had wholly merged into the peoples among whom they lived. In England, the descendants of the settlers of the Danelaw became simply English, their northern blood and northern ways woven so deeply into the fabric of the English people that they could no longer be separated out, surviving only in the place names and the borrowed words and the physical traces the archaeologists would later uncover. In Ireland, the Norse of the towns became part of the mingled population of the island. their cities enduring and growing into some of the great cities of Ireland, but their separate identity fading into the general life of the land. In Normandy, the descendants of the settlers had become thoroughly French, and from Normandy they went out, as we have seen, to shape the history of England and of much of Europe besides, carrying the restless energy of their northern ancestors into new forms and new lands, so that the blood of the Norsemen ran, in the end, through many of the ruling families of medieval Europe. And in the east, the northern element in the founding of the great Slavic realm was absorbed almost entirely into the Slavic population, surviving in little more than the name that the vast country would carry down the centuries, and in the dim memory of the northern founders preserved in the early chronicles. And in the far western colonies, the story ended, as we have seen, in slow fading and eventual silence. The North American settlement was abandoned almost as soon as it was made, its memory surviving only in the sagas until the archaeologists confirmed it 1,000 years later. And the Greenland colony, that furthest and most fragile outpost, slowly declined and died over the course of the later medieval centuries, its people gone, its farms and churches abandoned to the cold, its ending so gradual and so unremarked that even the exact manner of it remains uncertain, a whole community simply fading away at the edge of the Santam world. There is a particular sadness in the story of Greenland, in the thought of those last northern folk clinging to their farms beneath the great ice, cut off ever more completely from the world that had forgotten them, holding to their old ways as the climate cooled and the trade failed and the land grew harder, until at last there was no one left, and the wind and the snow moved over the empty steadings, and the memory of them faded from the world. And yet even that lost colony has been recovered. In a sense, for the archaeologists have studied the ruins of the Greenland farms and pieced together the story of their rise and their fall, so that the last northern folk of the ice are remembered again, their lives and their struggles brought back from the silence into which they had passed. For a long time after the age had ended, the Norsemen were remembered by the wider world, chiefly as the raiders and the terrors of the early medieval centuries, the fierce heathen men out of the north who had fallen upon the monasteries and the coasts. And this dark image, drawn largely from the frightened accounts of those they had raided, dominated the way later ages thought of them. The fuller and richer picture of the traders and the settlers and the explorers and the poets and the lawmakers was preserved above all in the writings of the Icelanders, in the sagas and the poems and the histories, but these were long known only to a few, written in a northern tongue and preserved in a remote island at the edge of Europe. And for many centuries the wider world knew little of them, and so the memory of the northern world survived. But survived unevenly, the dark image of the raider well known, and the fuller truth of their world hidden away in the old manuscripts of Iceland, waiting to be rediscovered. That fuller rediscovery came, in the end, in the modern centuries, as scholars turned their attention to the old northern writings and began to study and translate and understand them, opening up the rich world of the sagas and the myths and the poetry to the wider world. And it came too through the patient work of archaeology, through the excavation of the northern farms and towns and graves and ships, through the uncovering of the great ship burials with their preserved timber and treasures, through the discovery of the North American settlement that confirmed the truth behind the sagas, through the study of the Greenland ruins and the hoards of silver, and the traces of the northern presence across half of Europe and beyond. Piece by piece, through the study of the writings and the digging in the earth, the modern world recovered the fuller truth of the Norsemen, moving beyond the old image of the raider to see the whole complex and remarkable people, the farmers and the traders and the explorers and the artists and the poets, the builders of cities and the makers of law, the crossers of oceans and the keepers of stories. And with that recovery came, perhaps inevitably, a swing in the other direction, a tendency in some quarters to romanticize the Norsemen, to see them only as noble explorers and free-spirited adventurers, and to forget the real violence and the real suffering that had been part of their story, the raided monasteries, and the burned homes, and the human beings carried off into slavery. And this too we should be careful of, for the truth of the Norsemen, like the truth of most peoples, lies not in either extreme but in the holding together of the whole, in seeing them neither as mere savage raiders, nor as noble adventurers, but as human beings of their age, capable of both great violence and great artistry, of both cruelty and courage, of both the terror of the raid and the patient beauty of the farm, and the loom and the poem. They were not better or worse than the other peoples of their time, but they were, in certain ways, remarkable, in the reach of their voyages and the beauty of their art and the richness of the memory they left behind. And it is that remarkableness, held together with an honest acknowledgement of the whole of their story, that makes them so enduringly fascinating to us now. There is a great deal that we still do not know about the Norsemen, and a great deal that historians and archaeologists still debate. And it is worth dwelling for a moment on the limits of our knowledge, for they are part of the quiet mystery that draws us to this age. We do not have, from the Norsemen themselves during the age, any great body of writing that tells us directly what they thought and felt, for they were not, during the Viking Age itself, a people who wrote at length, using their runic letters mainly for short inscriptions, for names and memorials and simple messages, rather than for books and chronicles. The great written sources, the sagas and the myths and the histories, come from a later time, written down centuries after the events by people who were already Christian and who were shaping and interpreting the old memories through the lens of their own age. And so we must always read them with care, unsure how much is true memory and how much is later invention. Much of what we know comes instead from archaeology, from the mute testimony of the objects and the buildings and the graves, which tells us a great deal about how the Norsemen lived but little about what they thought, and from the accounts of outsiders, the frightened monks and the curious travelers who saw the Norsemen from without and often did not understand what they saw. And so our picture of the northern world, rich as it is, remains full of gaps and uncertainties, full of questions we cannot answer and mysteries we cannot solve. And there is a certain fitting quality in this, that a people so given to the open sea and the far horizon should remain, in the end partly hidden from us, glimpsed across the water rather than fully known. We do not know, for certain, exactly why the raids began when they did, though we have our theories of land hunger and ship technology and political ambition and the pull of southern wealth. We do not know exactly how the northern navigators found their way across the open ocean, though we can guess at their knowledge of sun and star and bird and wave. We do not know how far, exactly, the North American voyages reached, or how many they were, or how long the settlements lasted, for the sagas are vague and the archaeology gives us only glimpses. We do not know the true relationship between the Norsemen and the Slavic peoples in the founding of the Eastern realm, a question tangled with later politics and passions. We do not know the names or the stories of the vast majority of the people who lived through the age, the ordinary farmers and women and children and slaves whose lives were the ground from which all the great events grew, and who have left us only their bones and their tools and their houses in the earth. And there is a kind of humility that this uncertainty teaches us, a reminder that the past is always partly lost to us, that even the most studied of ages keeps its secrets, that behind the stories we can tell there stretches always a vast silence of the forgotten and the unknown. And yet, for all that is lost and uncertain, how much has been kept, and how vivid the northern world can still be made to seem across the gulf of 1,000 years. We can still stand in the presence of their actual ships, preserved in the earth and now in the great museums of the north, and see with our own eyes the beautiful curved timbers, the carved prows, the very vessels in which they sailed. We can still hold in our hands the silver they treasured, the coins carried from distant lands, the brooches and the beads and the little hammers of Thor. We can still read the stories they told, the sagas and the myths and the poems, and hear, however faintly and through however many later hands, the voice of the northern world speaking of its gods and its heroes and its ordinary folk. We can still walk the places where they lived, the sites of their farms and their towns, the lava plain where they held their assembly, the northern tip of Newfoundland, where they built their houses at the edge of a new world. We can still see their mark upon the map, in the names of the places they settled, and hear it in the words they left and the languages of the peoples they joined. For a people so long vanished, they have left us a remarkably rich inheritance, a whole world that can still be entered and explored and felt, if we come to it with patience and with care. What, then, are we to make of them, these northern voyagers, as we look back on them now from so far away, in the quiet of this night? What does their long story mean to us? And why does it hold us still? Part of it, surely, is the sheer drama and reach of their achievement, the astonishing span of their voyages, from the fjords of the homeland to the shores of America, from the golden city of the south to the ice of the far north, a scattered people from the cold edge of the world, reaching out to touch a great part of the known world of their age. Part of it is the vividness and the richness of the world they have left us, so much more fully known and felt than most of the vanished worlds of the past, so that we can enter it and walk through it and feel it near. And part of it, I think, is something deeper, something in the character of the northern people themselves and in the shape of their story that speaks to something in us. For their story is, in the end, a very human one, a story of ordinary people facing a hard world with courage and skill and imagination, of the hunger to go beyond the horizon and to find what lies beyond, of the making of homes and the raising of families and the keeping of laws and the telling of stories, of the awareness of impermanence and the longing to be remembered, of the passing of a whole world and the survival of its memory against all the odds. It is a story that holds together the light and the dark, the violence and the beauty, the cruelty and the courage, without pretending that either cancels out the other. And in that honest holding together there is a kind of wisdom, a reminder that human beings and human ages are complex things, not to be reduced to a single simple verdict of good or bad, but to be understood in their fullness and their contradiction. And it is a story that ends not in triumph or in tragedy, but in transformation and continuity, in the fading of one world and the flowing of its life into others, in the passing of the raiders and the settling of their descendants and the keeping of their memory, a reminder that endings are rarely as final as they seem, that the life of a people and a world flows on in ways we do not always see, carried forward in blood and language and memory and story into the ages that follow. There is a particular thought that I find myself returning to as this long tale draws toward its close, and it is the thought of memory itself, of the keeping and the losing and the recovering of the memory of a world. The Norsemen, as we have seen, were deeply aware of impermanence, deeply conscious that all things pass, that the treasure and the fame and the life itself are fleeting, and that the only thing that truly endures is the memory we leave behind. And there is a strange and moving fitness in the fact that this people, so aware of the passing of all things, should have left behind so rich a memory, so much more than most of the peoples of their age, precisely because they cared so much about memory, because they made the poems and told the stories and, when the time came, wrote them down. Their longing to be remembered, which drove so many of them out across the seas in search of fame and glory, has been fulfilled beyond anything they could have imagined. For here we are, 1,000 years later and half a world away, remembering them still, keeping their memory alive in the quiet of the night, feeling them near across the great gulf of time. And there is a comfort in this, I think, that reaches beyond their story to touch our own. For we too live in the awareness of impermanence. We too know that all things pass, that the worlds we know and love will one day be gone, that we ourselves must one day return to the earth. And the story of the Norsemen offers us, in its quiet way, a kind of consolation. The reminder that memory can outlast the passing of a whole world, that the things that seem most surely doomed to be forgotten can yet be kept and carried forward, that a vanished world can still, in the quiet places of memory, be made to live again. The raiders are long gone, and the old gods are faded into story, and the distant colonies are dead beneath the ice, and the whole great age of the Voyages has passed away into the deep silence of the past. And yet the memory endures, kept and carried forward by those who came after, and by those who care to remember, so that the northern world, for all its passing, is not truly lost, but lives on quietly in the sagas and the ships and the silver and the stones, and in the telling of its story on nights such as this. So let us bring the tale gently now to its close, and let the northern world settle at last into its long rest. Let us stand, for one final moment, in the world we have traveled through together, and let it grow quiet around us as the night deepens and sleep draws near. Let us see, one last time, the long fjords of the homeland running deep and gray between the mountains, and the farms scattered along the good land, and the long halls with their fires burning low, and the families gathered close in the warm dark of the winter, wrapped in wool against the cold. Let us see the ships drawn up on the beaches, their voyaging done, their sails furled, their beautiful curved timbers dark against the pale northern light. Let us see the trading towns fallen quiet, the workshops still, the harbors empty, the silver weighed and stored away. Let us see the assembly on the lava plain standing empty under the wide pale sky, the law spoken and the year's business done. The free farmers gone home to their farms across the island. Let us see the great city of the south with its golden domes, and the young northern guardsman standing quiet at his post, his name idly carved into the marble where it will survive 1,000 years. Let us see Iceland beneath its stars, and Greenland beneath its ice, and the far shore of America lying quiet and forgotten beneath the forest, waiting for the centuries to pass. And let us see, most of all, the deep and patient continuity of it, the way the northern world, for all its passing, flowed on into the ages that followed, into the nations it helped to shape, and the languages it enriched, and the memory it left behind. The raiders became settlers, and the settlers became English and Irish and French and Slavic, and the pagan north became the Christian kingdoms of Scandinavia, and the old gods became the tales told by the fire, and the whole restless energy of the age settled into the slower rhythms of medieval life, transformed but not destroyed, ended but not lost. And through all the long centuries that followed, the memory of the northern world was kept in the writings of the Icelanders and in the earth that held their ships and their treasures and their homes, waiting to be recovered, waiting to be told again, waiting to reach us here, in the quiet of this night, 1,000 years and half a world away. The whole great age of the Norsemen is gone now, passed away into the deep silence of the past, as all ages pass. The ships have sailed their last voyages and been drawn up on the beaches for the final time. The halls have fallen silent. The fires burned down to ash. The households long since gone to their rest. The old gods have faded into story, and the raiders into memory, and the distant colonies into the silence of the ice and the forest. And yet the memory endures, kept and carried forward across the centuries, so that the northern world, for all its passing, is not truly gone, but lives on, quietly, in the stories we tell and the things they left behind, and in the feeling of nearness that comes to us across the gulf of time when we sit by the fire in the night and speak of them, of their ships and their gods and their words, of their courage and their artistry and their long, restless reaching across the seas of the world. Rest now, as the northern world rests, in the deep peace of the winter dark. The sea is gray and patient beyond the fjords, and the mountains are white with snow, and the aurora is shifting green and silver far overhead, and all across the northern world the fires are burning low, and the households are settling into sleep. The long story is told, and the age is ended, and the memory is kept, and there is nothing more that needs to be done tonight, nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you must remember. You may simply rest as they rest in the quiet and the dark, while the old world settles softly around you and the last candle of the story burns slowly down. The ships are home, and the sails are furled, and the sea is still. The fires are banked, and the halls are quiet, and the snow lies deep and silent over the northern valleys. The whole great age of the Norsemen has come to rest, and its memory lies safe and warm in the quiet places of the heart, kept and carried forward into the ages, as the light of a vanished world can still, on nights such as this, be made gently to shine. Sleep now, and let it shine softly, in the dark, as the night closes at last around the old world of the north, and all grows still, and all is well.